The secular community continues to make dents in the huge religious, political, economic confluence that keeps our society entrapped within the conceptual paradigm of an outmoded document replete with violence, rage, injustice, superstition, and supernatural events. Our secular scholars chip away at the monumental fraud of the Christian Bible. Bit by bit, we will someday supplant its dark and puzzling vision with a secular one of clarity, science, and reason. Attempting to find guidance from it and believing in its credibility is injuring us in formulating sensible and humane ethics and morals, and helping keep people apart by reinforcing ancient and outworn enmities. The secular community looks forward with anticipation to the dawning of the rising sun of reason, which will dispel the fog of an ancient, irrelevant, and nonsensical document from an ancient world that we no longer understand or relate to. Thank you for your attention this evening.
Amen. Very good.
Wow. Excellent.
Very good.
There we go.
All right. I have some questions first and then some comments. The questions on the Apocrypha that you mentioned, I know was included in the Christian Bible,
Yes.
but not in the Hebrew.
Actually, in the Catholic Bible.
What we
only.
would now call the Catholic Bible,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's not in the Jewish Old Testament.
No.
So why did the Jews, which was supposedly their own stories, right, in the Apocrypha, why
Yeah.
wouldn't they have included that in the canon of the Old Testament?
You know, I'm not sure, but I think it's because it didn't agree probably with some other things that they had included in the Old Testament. That's usually the case, you know, and that's why the Protestants wanted to leave it out also.
So they were aware that there were some contradictions that
Right.
they didn't want to make others
Exactly,
question.
yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, there's so many contradictions in the whole Bible than inclusion or exclusion. It's usually political or doctrinal, and anything that's left in or put out, as I've read tonight.
You mentioned that the religious Jews of the day, of that time, or even before Jesus, knew Greek, but why would they have learned Greek if they were trying to separate, if they weren't trying to Hellenize those that were very traditionalists?
I don't think I said that.
You mentioned that they knew that the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, some of them were in Greek.
Oh, yes, yes. Well,
But-
obviously there were
Okay.
copies.
There was copies of some early
Right,
texts.
that were probably in Greek. Or else
were
it was
they-
Greeks that copied them. It was like Greek scribes that copied them, like Greek scholars.
So do you think
Would
that
be.
those scrolls were not actually written down at that site?
No, I
By
doubt,
the Essenes.
no, they weren't. I think that they were placed there. Now, exactly why they were placed there, I don't think do we know at this point?
Well, it was for safekeeping, but,
Yeah.
they were, the people that lived there were wiped out by the Romans.
Okay, well, perhaps maybe that's why they did it, because I know that the things at Nag Hammadi were when the Bishop Athanasius started a crackdown on, doctrinal heresies and what have you. He didn't want any, kind of, what he considered Gnostic heresies, lying around loose or anything else. So the people in this monastery who were probably basically Gnostic buried all those texts, all those gospels, so we're very lucky to have those. So that's usually what happens for safekeeping. They were afraid that everything would be destroyed. And indeed, they were probably right, because that's all we have left.
Is there any actually documented history of people destroying books for those reasons that we can draw on? Did they burn certain copies of books?
Oh, yeah.
At that
Sure,
time?
on and off, yeah.
I mean, not
Oh, yeah,
in the Middle Ages,
yeah.
but even at that time
Oh,
of
yeah.
Christ.
Oh,
they
yeah,
were destroying
definitely,
things.
definitely. They were destroying everything. I mean, that's why I say we're so lucky to have the Gnostic texts, and they buried them so deeply, we didn't find them until 1945.
You mentioned that the epistles is a completely different Jesus than the Gospels.
Right.
Could you explain that? I guess I'm not familiar with the epistles.
Apparently, what the epistles talk about is just what I was talking about, that what they found is that they don't talk about Jesus' life or any of the miracles or anything like that. It's just this very puzzling story of a Jesus being, or actually of a Christ being sent to earth and atoning and, being killed.
But these were Paul's sermons, though, weren't they?
Some of them were Paul's letters, but not
Yeah.
all the epistles were by Paul.
But were these even intended to be a history, or were these more?
No,
just
they
a-
were instructional, because
Instructional.
most Christians were illiterate at that time.
So isn't it conceivable that they would have left out the historical details?
No, I can't, why would you? Why would you when you're instructing a lot of people who weren't Jews, but they were like Gentiles? Remember, they were like, expanding the church enormously at that time. And why wouldn't you tell these people this rather interesting story?
So you see it's a contradiction. It isn't just another expansion of the Jesus story. It's a contradiction of the
Yeah,
Gospels.
Yeah, and why Paul? I mean, he came after Jesus, but he was close to that date. I mean, he would talk, wouldn't he talk to people? Wouldn't he talk to some of the apostles that were still alive?
It's
Wouldn't they tell
conceivable.
him these narratives?
Yeah.
And why wouldn't he tell this story? He was a great storyteller. He was a great proponent of, getting people to convert, basically. I can't imagine Paul not giving them that story. It's this very kind of dark, strange story that he's telling, like kind of a mystery story or something.
Okay.
It almost doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
But what does make sense is a lot of scholars have thought that was one of the reasons that Christianity took hold, that it was linked to a real person. Remember, there were a lot of gods at that time that they were worshiping, like Mithras and Osiris and what have you, and that Jesus was supposedly a real person. So maybe when they started talking about it, maybe they realized that it sounded good. People resonated with it. The baby Jesus and.
But Paul wasn't doing that.
No, Paul wasn't, but the gospel writers certainly were. They certainly formed a beautiful narrative from something.
You mentioned the Jewish sacrifice of humans, but you didn't give any evidence for that. You didn't mention anything about.
No, but it's in what's his name's, can't remember his name now. Anyway, it's in his talk, and I just gave the reference for that. It's in his
Callahan?
section. No, it wasn't Callahan, it was, let me see here. Joe Edward Barnhart, in his Bible and Violence.
So that would be a good reference for this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Prometheus Books 2007, and it's in that new encyclopedia, pages 134 to 137. And he's referenced his findings very well.
In the encyclopedia?
Right. So I used him as my reference.
Okay. Okay, good. You just touched on the archaeological evidence at the end, but I mean, is there more that you can say? Because there's certainly, if you go to visit Israel today, you can be taken to Ruth's tomb and Abraham's tomb. And
I
all
have
of
a
these
suspicion
tombs.
a lot of them are just fictitious.
So,
I
but
think
what
they're
is?
tourist attractions.
Yeah, I mean, so haven't the archaeologists spoken out and said, hey, these are not really those tombs?
Well, I think that they don't want to disrupt things. If you notice, they're still trying to say in their book that this is, this was formulated and it's a great legend of the Jewish people. So they're saying it's a legend. I think that they don't want to disrupt things too far.
Okay.
And I think that that's the thing.
And you're familiar with the book Walking the Bible?
No.
I forget who that's by, but he basically makes these claims that these are true archaeological sites.
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah, so this is by a Jewish author.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I doubt that very much. I think what they're unearthing more and more, if they're honest, is that most of these things are non-existent. There might be a couple
Do you have any hope that we will find some other scrolls, like the Dead Sea Scrolls? in the
You know, a
future?
lot of scholars don't think we will, but I don't know, we might. I mean, why not? These have all popped up, the Dead Sea Scrolls have popped up, the Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi, you know, and those have all been very, very important.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? I mean, we always think we've unearthed everything and then something else pops, you know?
But most of the scrolls were in such a bad condition,
Yeah,
and they were stored in conditions that would have been ideal if all you had was, desert to store something in.
yeah.
They were stored in these large vessels in a cave that's relatively dry, but they were deteriorating so bad they had to piece them together. So it is, I think, very unlikely that we'll ever find anything in the number of scrolls that we did in the Dead Sea.
Right, and also Nag Hammadi too, they had to piece them together. People that found them originally, somebody's mother-in-law used some of them for fire, to start fires and things. So some of the stuff, they've been years deciphering some of the things and reconstructing them. So it will be hard, I mean, but, I have hopes that we'll get more finds like that.
And you think that will help the atheist, or would it help the religious people?
Well, I think it's going to help the secular community more, the atheist community and the secular community, basically for this reason, that the more we find them, the more we realize that these are all copies and that there aren't any originals. And the more we find them, now I'm not really that familiar with the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I know that these Gospels that are emerging from the Nag Hammadi finds are incredibly strange. I mean, I've read the Thomas Gospel, and if whoever was making these pronouncements, they were very strange. I mean, they have some of the same information that's in the Gospels, but there's some very strange to us that grew up in the Christian tradition. I mean, this so-called Jesus makes statements that he finds gender irrelevant and very interesting kind of, ideas like this, and finding the truth from within. And
Sounds like a New Age.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Gnostics were kind of like interior and, kind of a little spacier than the real organized church. That's probably why they fell to the wayside.
Are you going to be covering them?
Yes, I'll be covering them when I do the devil.
Okay.
Yeah, the devil and the origins and the rise and fall of the devil and the early church and the later church. the church and the devil rose and fell together.
And then when we talk about the historical Jesus and the fact that there's no historical records, no secular records from either the Jews or from which actually is important to point out, the Jews didn't record them either, or the Romans who were occupying them.
Yeah, there's mentions in some of the Roman literature, but it's later. And it's probably, they think it was probably told them, by, Judaic people.
Josephus added, somebody added it for Josephus.
Josephus, yeah.
And then
he's never very accurate anyway.
But he wasn't accurate, and it was
No.
only a paragraph.
Yeah.
But what was the qualities, so that we can compare what other things were recorded, well recorded at that time, that
Well,
would
the
be
Romans
compared?
were terrific
What
record
did they
keepers
record?
like the Egyptians. They recorded almost every historical fact that you can think of. They were pretty good.
The changing of the guard
Yeah,
in Jerusalem, for example.
They would have recorded.
That's
it was
recorded.
recorded.
It was recorded.
It was recorded.
What
They
is
know
it,
who
changing
was in
guard?
charge of Jerusalem at that time. They know what regiment was there.
Yeah, you'll see that when I
So
do the
account
devil
of
in the early church.
The
yeah.
number of people, a census would have been there.
Well, actually, David did the first census apparently in the Israelite lands. Yeah, and the people did not like it at all.
So I'm just trying to give examples to people,
Oh,
when
I
I
see.
say there's no evidence of it. Jesus, they could say, well, people just didn't write down history.
Oh no, the Romans
they
were
wrote it
meticulous history keepers, meticulous record keepers.
So-
What they're saying is that they don't know history very well.
The people
Really,
who
when
are
they
saying.
say that, yeah, because they think that these early people, I think what they're saying is that they think that these early people were so ignorant and they didn't write things down.
Yeah.
But they weren't. I mean, the Greeks and then the Romans, actually Romans were like more meticulous record keepers than the Greeks. And everything was written down. I mean, we kind of know some of their recipes, we know how the people dressed, we know all kinds of,
That's what I'm wondering.
little facts. Oh, it's
Minutia,
incredible.
they had minutia
Oh, yeah,
still.
minutia, yeah. Yeah, you can find them just very quickly if you don't, I mean, that was my field, classics, so I know quite a bit about it, but you can find them in the dictionaries, of classical dictionaries. And you can see how much was written down, how much was known. We know an awful lot about
So
those
that
things.
if Jesus did exist, he was such a minor figure that nobody bothered to write anything
Exactly,
about it.
why would they? I mean, like I say, all we have are these later things which were probably told to, Roman historians by Jews. We don't have anything at that particular time that's authentic, and that is for sure. And if he were that important, I mean, Pontius Pilate was a really barbarous man, and they were crucifying, hundreds of people. I think during the time that he was, the governor, I think, or whatever
Yeah.
they called it, of
Jerusalem or Judah,
yeah, Judea at the time, that thousands of people were crucified. A lot of them, even if they were seditious or against the government, say rebels, they were like crucified as thieves and what have you. Another reason that they probably talked so much about Jesus' crucifixion, they were trying to make it clear that he was not, some kind of criminal. And remember, the two thieves are hung on either side. He's distinguished from that idea of thievery. Because they just simply put them up and and crucified them. So it doesn't seem that there was any significance at all if he was a historical personage to his death. Seems like there isn't any. Now, we do have these Gnostic Gospels, and we have, Mary's Gospel. We even have Judas's now, where Judas claimed he was a buddy and was like, together with Jesus on some of this stuff. Some people think that they conspired, that Jesus, thinking that he would get the inner light and like leave the body behind, because the Gnostics were kind of into that, that Jesus conspired to, be killed and then, arise again properly. And Mary has talks about Jesus and him being risen. So maybe he was a historical personage. There's no way of knowing. These are Gnostic texts, and again, they're not original.
What do you say to someone then that you might meet but that you want to refute in a couple of minutes? What do you say when they say, "Oh, I believe that the Bible is the Word of God"?
Well, I mean, how can I refute that if they believe something that's untrue? I mean, you can only refute it with a certain amount of facts. That the scholars have found enormous errancies, inaccuracies. That we don't have any extant originals. That a lot of it was political. But I don't believe that people that believe that thoroughly will be convinced at all by any kind of argument like that.
They won't budge.
But yeah, I'm just trying to summarize, what
I know.
you've already said tonight. I'm just trying to distill that into, a few facts to say, well, it's internally inconsistent, it's
Completely.
externally inconsistent,
Yeah.
and that the history doesn't match the archaeology.
No, yeah, nothing.
The other literature doesn't match.
Norm, you're always concise. You always get it. You put it in a nutshell.
That's it.
That's it.
That's it.
But you know what? You just try to tell somebody that believes.
But I agree with you, it's 100%. It should match up. There should be a correspondence there.
Some. I mean, we don't expect
Some, yeah, at
everything,
least some
but it's
correspondence.
so insanely.
But it's
you know,
so off.
Like Joseph Smith did exist, this guy Joseph Smith.
Yeah, there we
in the
go. We
19th
know he
century.
existed. Yeah, he was a con man.
He
but
made up all
existed.
these other
Yeah,
stories,
yeah.
Yeah.
but there was a guy.
He was there,
See?
yeah.
So the government, somebody wrote down
Yeah.
about what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't we have that about Jesus?
Yeah, and that would be actually a good comparison because he
It
was
is a good
murdered.
That's a
comparison.
good
Yeah.
He was murdered by a mob.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not unlike Jesus.
Yeah.
So, and then look what happened.
Yeah, that is. That's a great comparison.
Because
That
your
really
future president will believe that.
Yeah.
Just a few more questions. comment, I guess now I have some comments. You mentioned the P version. That's the version that people in the anti-circumcision movement believe that was the author added circumcision at that point, that Abraham
More than likely,
circumcised
yes,
Isaac
yes. All those
was
things
added
have been
as
added.
a few paragraphs.
Yeah,
Also in response to the contemporary times when people were abandoning the practice of circumcision,
that's right.
and they wanted to return to that practice.
Yes.
So they
Right.
put it in.
I'm trying to remember, who was the, that wasn't Ezra, was it? It was who was the prophet that led the people?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, okay.
Both
that's it.
Jeremiah and also Elijah
Okay, yeah,
both said you have to return to circumcision.
right, yeah.
So
They
you can
started
see
circumcising everybody,
At different
yeah.
times, they struggled with this. Moses
Right.
also didn't circumcise his boy, according to the Old Testament. So that's a very interesting point to make. Also, it occurred to me, when you talk about Ezra and also the oral traditions, is that it would be very easy to embellish the oral traditions because you could just add it.
Sure.
And if it hadn't been written down,
Sure,
Mhm.
even someone who had heard it many times before would suddenly hear a new version,
yeah.
and that version then would get
Eventually, yeah.
Passed
yeah.
on.
There would be people who would disagree with it, but remember, a lot of times these oral versions, or at least, I know that in the Greek mythology, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were told by these oral, and they would go around at special occasions, weddings, holy days of some sort commemorating what some god had done or what have you, and they would be recited. So it wouldn't be too hard to, a lot of times, people would improvise, and people really like to change. So maybe they would like these little interpolations. And they'd say, well, that's kind of nice, I didn't hear that. Oh yeah, that was told by whoever, Oh yeah, I didn't make this up, in other words.
Yeah, they had no way of proving
Mhm.
that someone was adding something.
Yeah,
If
exactly.
it wasn't written down, and if they didn't read,
Yeah,
how
exactly.
would they even know?
Yeah. That
Okay.
they, as I mentioned, these oral traditions in the Balkans, I had really gone over them a lot when I was studying the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it is nonlinear. It was very nice to come by that again when I was doing this biblical thing. And it is. There were additions, there were subtractions. Each singer had their own version, each bard, that because they were kind of like sing-song tellings. And they're extremely interesting. There's even a pace that they developed, and I'm sure that the Hebrew singers or bards would the oral tradition would do this about the same thing, because primitive peoples do this. The Greeks did it, probably the Jews did it. I mean, certainly the Balkans while they were still primitive.
Now, there is a claim among Jews that David wrote the Psalms,
Right, I doubt if
know,
that's true at all.
that not only was he a king and a
Yeah,
warrior,
but a great poet.
but a great poet as well.
Doesn't that sound like the Near East?
The hero,
That they're kings, that they're
that they
they
do
were like,
everything well.
yeah, that they were great poets. In fact,
Yeah.
some of them actually did write poetry.
But how
It
would
sounds
we-
very much in that tradition of
Yeah,
that Near East.
the caution is that when things start to become heaped upon this one individual, proceed with caution.
But how would we
That's
actually
in your
prove?
lecture.
That's it, yeah.
How would we prove? We can't prove it.
We can't prove it,
We
no.
just say that this is another extension of the David myth.
Right, we
Yeah.
think, yeah.
Very good.
It seems like it's almost doubtful, it seems like maybe he was a historical personage. There's
Well,
some mention of him, yeah.
It's startling because I remember in Sunday school, all of this is taught as fact. There isn't a statement that these are myths or these are
No,
possibilities. Even just the plain old history. Let's just put aside the miracles
yeah,
and
Yeah.
the metaphysical phenomenon. Just he was a king and then he was a king and then he was a king.
Yeah.
All of that is presented as fact.
yeah. That's the way, I learned everything too in Christian Sunday school and in,
Yeah.
the Catholic girls' school I went to.
But the Jews say, well, but you see all of these kings, particularly after Solomon, were corrupt. They were all very corrupted kings, and that too is in the Bible. It is in the Book of Kings.
Okay.
And what follows is that these were kings that were, and even Solomon were backsliders, and corrupt. And so the Jews say, well, if it wasn't true, why would we have put this in? Because these kings were wicked.
Oh, I see,
So
I
these were
see.
Jewish kings that were wicked. Why would we have put in this bad stuff about all the Jews who built the golden calf?
But what came after that, though? Wasn't that probably leading up to something?
Well, there was there was punishment.
Yeah.
The kingdom was split into two.
That's what I
You know,
mean.
and the northern tribes supposedly, were lost.
Yeah.
Well, they weren't lost. They were just integrated with the rest of the conquered peoples.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think you'd probably find that there was a political reason for everything that was, put down.
Yes. A couple of things maybe you could have mentioned had you had the time. I know you didn't have a lot of time to squeeze in everything, but there's no true knowledge of the world imparted in the Bible. That is, there's nothing about a plant that was previously unknown.
No.
Everything in the Bible was information that was already known
Yeah,
to the writer. So there
exactly.
was I hesitate to use the word science, but there was nothing that was revealed, like such as there's this other continent called the New World.
Right,
There was nothing revealed that we can then verify in the real
No.
world and say, yes, this is true.
As a matter of fact, why is it so inaccurate? Why didn't God make these guys more accurate? God certainly, if there was one, which we know there isn't, but he would certainly know measurements properly, mathematics, distances, lengths, things like that. Why wouldn't he inspire the writers to give us the right facts?
And that David and Isaiah both were rewritten after, by the Christians to try and make it look like they foretold the coming of Jesus.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
Was manipulated
Yeah,
going forward.
Yeah.
The Jews dispute, that those versions of Isaiah and
well, I'm sure they're right,
of
too.
David, but that's what was done, and it's quite obvious if you look at the text. Also, as I recall, in the Old Testament, unicorns are mentioned. Matter of fact,
I don't remember that,
existence of
but I'm
unicorns.
sure they mentioned so many things
Some
that are
people-
matter-of-factly that are absolutely
Absolutely
incorrect.
there.
It's sad.
yeah.
I don't see how, well, that's why a lot of people, I think, have become partially at least unbelievers, or at least they don't believe in the Bible when they start studying it.
There's a lot of apologetics out there, though. There's a lot of people who want to explain away these contradictions.
Oh, yes.
They do continuously,
And
but,
there was a rabbi I used to know in Troy. I forget his actual name because everybody called him Rabbi Arnie. He was a gay rabbi. He is a gay rabbi. He still practices in a conservative congregation. And he claimed that he went back and he read, Leviticus in Aramaic or in Hebrew, I guess. And he said it doesn't really condemn homosexuality.
yes, it does, so, yeah, I know,
He was a homosexual.
I know. That's just what Berliner
It's a myth.
was talking about.
You read it for yourself.
Yeah.
It's a misunderstanding.
Yeah, it's always a
Terrible
misunderstanding. It's always a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they do in Islam many times. Oh no, this was a mistranslation.
Yeah.
Because this new translation fits what I wanted
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's really
Everybody does that.
a dictum against wanton sexuality, that it was saying,
Yeah.
don't be promiscuous.
No,
It wasn't,
it's-
don't have sex with men.
It's very clear though.
It is very clear, and this is
And the penetrator
infuriating.
should be killed. That's what they say. They
The
say in there
penetrator.
that the penetrator.
Is that in Leviticus as well?
Yes, it's in Leviticus.
Okay.
I've seen it actually. I looked at that
Yeah.
passage.
Yeah, not only that, but the people who intermarry is also, that they should be killed as well, Jew and Gentile.
Wow.
Who marries a Jew. But there's an enormous amount of that kind of gymnastics that goes on to people so they can keep their faith, I suppose. And I think we need a popularizer. How evolution has been popularized by Dawkins and by Gould and by
Good point.
Coyne and these others. We need a popularizer for this biblical criticism.
Yeah.
Ehrman and Price, they're still too academic
Yeah.
to appeal to the mass
Yeah.
audience. So I'm hoping, for a Messiah who will spread the word in an
Yeah.
entertaining way, who actually get up there and on stage or
But
wherever.
see, it wouldn't be very entertaining. He'd have to be very funny because,
Oh, sure.
people would be devastated because they've been told it's the truth.
Well, first you're going to attract the people who already agree with you.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I think it could be very entertaining to an atheist
Well,
audience.
to an atheist
Oh,
audience,
yeah.
but can you imagine to Christians and things, that's the people we have to reach. I mean,
Eventually.
atheists don't believe it, you know.
But eventually we'll reach those people who are doubters, who don't go to church, and even those who.
Well, that's a good point.
do, so
Yeah,
I-
because there's more and more people.
The transitional group.
Yeah, they
Transitional
are
group.
transitional now, we have more and more. What I would like to see, and I'm not the only one, Ian Banks, what's his name? I can't remember his name right now. He's an atheist and he's a novelist. And he talks about it in some of his works, and other people have been taking this up now, that what we need is a great narrator of evolution. A story, a narrative, because they're right, people like narratives, you
A
know.
narrative on evolution?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, we need some kind of narrative that will make it like a pretty story of some
Yeah.
sort, or an interesting story that will catch people and resonate. Right now, you know, they're not interested in it.
Well, I think that's been done with Darwin's biography. I think that people
Yeah, but
have.
not enough, not enough. Not enough has been done with evolution itself, you know, and the whole thing. I know what they need.
Mhm.
I know what they need. People need something that they
That
can,
would
a
take
hook.
a tremendous person's, intellectual person's soul.
They would also have
Tremendous
to be a great
invented,
writer. They would have to
creative.
be a very, very good writer,
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
We need a mythologist of evolution.
I mean, a couple other comments, these are suggestions really for some improvements, is you mentioned the governor of Texas, but that will date your lecture.
Yeah, I thought about that too,
Say
but I
Dr.
couldn't
Perry.
resist putting it in.
Yeah, no, I think, it's a good example of, the 21st century fundamentalism.
Yeah,
But yeah, this was Governor Perry,
Yeah.
who also didn't know the three departments of government that he wanted to eliminate.
that was funny, I remember that.
Yeah.
A momentary lapse, he said.
Yeah, and, when I'm thinking about that, is also, there's so many people who believe in the Noah story,
Yeah,
the flood,
yeah.
that they cling, more than most Bible stories, they want to cling to this idea that there was this great flood. And that's,
Although, that, the flood,
There were a
Is-
batch of floods.
there were so many, in the ancient world, so many stories of that. You can find it in so many of the
Oh, yeah.
ancient people's stories.
Well, what was going on
These great floods.
in the year 10,000,
Yeah.
between 15,000 BC and 10,000 BC, what was happening? The glaciers were melting like
Yeah.
crazy. So, here come the
but how did
floods.
it get to the Middle East? How did those stories find their way to the Middle East?
Yeah.
Well, the Nile overflowed, of course, that was kind of fertilizing
Yeah.
every year. But there must have been floods,
Oh,
maybe they
yeah.
weren't as large, as they make them out to be. Remember that, again, you have these oral traditions, and you have the elders, the people that maybe had survived them and were very old,
Yeah.
and they stretched them out of, like proportion. I can remember my grandmother telling me about, and other young people, the older people, the adults used to, kind of laugh behind her back and scoff, but we kids believed her for a long time, the crossing to America, and how a huge sea turtle came up and threatened the boat. I mean, there's no sea turtle that large. We used to love those stories. And how, I forget they took cannons and shot it. And then everyone had turtle soup. And with everybody on board, even those in the steerage,
This
which
was
the
a story
immigrants would be.
from whom?
My grandmother.
Your grandmother, as if she had witnessed
Well,
it?
she had crossed over
She had
naturally
crossed
to
over.
America on the
She
ship.
claimed that
Yes,
this
she
was a true
witnessed
story.
it. Yes, and it was
Yeah.
the best turtle soup that she had ever had.
Wow.
But
Wow.
it-
And how old was she when she crossed though?
She was like about, I think she was a young girl, so she was about 15 or 16.
So she had elaborated that much.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it was a great story, believe me. I loved hearing it. I believed it, for a long time when I was a little girl.
And then what happened?
Well, I found out that sea turtles weren't that large where they would threaten a huge ship.
Yeah, one thing that would be very interesting to do would be to line up the dates. Geologists tell us that the Black Sea at one time was dammed up, and that there was a disruption at the Bosporus,
Yeah.
and there was a tremendous rush of water through that whole area. So that indeed would be the Middle East.
I think there were a lot
It
of like
flooded
smaller
everything,
floods.
flooded everything.
Yeah. But the smaller floods would, a lot of
But
people would
a whole bunch of
perish. Remember,
smaller
there weren't
floods.
that many people at that time.
No.
That would threaten a whole population, a small, not a small flood, but a large flood. But it wouldn't be as large as it was made out to be, as my grandmother's turtle. It was totally
Wow,
mythological.
that's an amazing story.
It's obvious in your lecture that, it appears to be in your lectures, that man has made God over to fit his needs in each era.
Yes,
And God has moved from the remote sky, this is over thousands of years now, moved from the remote sky location to walking among men on earth,
yeah,
and now in this era to coming into, and a man looking over his shoulder all the time, see if God is there.
Yeah.
And now into this era, the claims of being born again and having God inside you, inside your
Yeah,
brain.
very good point.
Yeah.
Very good point.
So now you can't look over your shoulder because he's in there.
Yeah, and
you're in direct
and they talk with him.
24 hours a day
Yeah.
communication.
Yeah.
What more do you want?
Yeah, exactly. Now you're carrying God with
Now
you.
you're-
There's like a quartet of books. Trying to remember the lady author who did. I think she was a former nun. I'm not sure about that, but somebody, and then a guy also wrote like a history of God. He comes out of some English department, and I don't think he really disputes the fact that there is a God, maybe. But he does show that God kind of grows along with the centuries and changes, which is so psychoanalytic and silly. It's unbelievable.
Well, that's the two other modern apologies is the Bible is just a metaphor that we atheists, we're taking it too seriously.
Right, I know.
And we're
Which
getting
part?
upset about it.
Yeah, which part though?
But the Methodists, the Episcopals, the Unitarians even would say, oh no, it's just a metaphor about how to be a good person.
Yeah, but they're not very good people in there.
But they're not good people, yeah. But then they single out Jesus and say, no, Jesus was just a good guy. He was just a good example of how to live your
Yeah, a
life.
good ethicist. But
So how do you
really,
reply to that?
but look at the stories about him. They were kind of silly in a way, really. Did he really go into that much ethics? There's just a
Well, let
Sermon
who
on
is
the Mount.
without sin throw the first stone.
Yeah,
for
that's
example.
kind of nice, but I think, I think that they find out, well, it never happened, obviously. I think it was actually a later interpolation, as a matter of fact. I think Elaine Pagels talks about
Put
that.
an addition
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah, I think Elaine Pagels talks about that, because I can remember reading that fairly recently.
That this was actually a criticism of the Jews
Yeah,
who would stone
Yeah.
adulterers.
yeah.
Important. And like I said, I think we need a popularizer, somebody who is willing to get up in front of a large audience and say, let me explain to you why all of this is ridiculous. I
Yeah.
want to explain to you why all of these Bible stories that you were taught as a child are absolutely nonsense.
You have a point, except, people still do Bible studies. There's a lot of Bible study
Groups, yes.
Well, yeah, and you mean among the religious people?
Yeah, oh yeah, well, of course, among their religious too, but they don't study it in the same way, but I've overheard people at Detroit Public Library, they're sitting at the research, the tables where I'm doing my research, and, they're carrying on, like, one guy will be telling another guy, what this biblical passage means, and of course, it's all nonsense. And I believe the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's one of the main basis of their services, where they discuss, the Bible, and interpret it according to their elders or what have you. It's going to be very hard to break that from people. See, because really, in a way, their ministers and their elders and things, for many people, are controlling those interpretations. They're saying this is what they mean. And you notice, because the Episcopalians and the Unitarians aren't, people say, well, then this is just a metaphor. We don't have to pay attention to it. Actually, there was Adam Gottschalk did a piece on Mormons recently in the New Yorker, and he was making the same claims, because he was I am Gopnik, I'm sorry. He feels very superior as an intellectual, and he is a splendid writer. But he was saying the same thing about the Mormons now. Oh, the Mormons really take a lot of these things now as metaphors. Yeah, there's a liberal wing of Mormons that really don't take
Well,
all
why
this
be a
stuff
Mormon?
serious.
Yeah, then why be?
Why be a Christian?
Yeah, well, he didn't go into that because he was just discussing, the
Yeah.
background of the Mormon thing. But it was, yeah, exactly. But I guess because they want to have the faith, they feel comfortable in the
Yeah.
faith. And so they don't take, he claims that they don't take the liberal wing of the Mormons, a lot of them do not take those things any more seriously than Christians take the things in the Bible.
Well, the Catholics are notorious for ignoring the Pope.
Well, yeah, especially American Catholics.
You can't
Yeah.
take the prohibitions against use of birth control.
Yeah, they pay no
Their
attention to
families
that.
would be 10 and 12 children.
But yet they don't want to leave the church. I mean, Gary Wills is a
Yeah.
terrific critic. I mean, he's a really wonderful historian of American history, and he's criticized the church for years and the priests and the way they've
Right.
Their sexual things with little boys and what have you. But he explains in another book why he won't leave the church. That's his identity as a Catholic. They won't leave, some of them. I would leave. I mean, if I don't believe in a religion, all the tenets, the main tenets, I would leave.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, me too.
But then there's Episcopalians who don't believe a word, and yet they'll write and say, write out that they like the socializing. They don't want to miss that sense of, being in a community of people that care for them, what have you, and so they remain. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. I couldn't stand to sit there and listen to a sermon of things I didn't believe. It makes no sense to me at all, but apparently it makes perfect sense to them.
There's a an atheist comedian, a duo, and I'm so embarrassed because I can't think of the name right now. One of them is very tall and heavy, and the other one is
Penn and Teller.
Penn and Teller.
Yeah,
I think it's Teller is the heavier set one. I'm not sure.
isn't that Penn?
Or whatever.
Penn
whoever.
Jillette. Penn
Yeah,
Jillette's
Penn
the
Jillette.
big,
That's
the big
right,
guy.
yeah,
yeah.
He's a big
Yeah, he's
barber,
a big
too.
guy.
Penn.
Yeah, he wrote a book,
I saw him
remember?
in an interview, and he said that he came from a very fundamentalist background, and he made a deal, Calvinist, and he made a deal with his parents. He wouldn't go to services on Sunday morning if he went to youth seminars in the afternoon with the minister.
Oh, boy.
And they made a deal with him, he didn't have to go to services if he went to the minister's sessions.
What did he do, disrupt them?
And no, and they examined the Bible and so forth and so on. He said, the best way for a Christian to get rid of Christianity is to sit down and read the Bible from
Yeah.
cover to cover.
Yeah.
Because when you get to the end, if you're a thinking person,
Yeah.
when you get to the end, you'll say, oh my goodness, what am I doing with this stuff?
Yeah.
And he said, I recommend heartily a thorough reading of the Bible or the Quran or whatever.
Whatever holy
And
book.
say, is this rational? Is this really something
Yeah.
I can live with?
Yeah. But again, not all people
No.
want to think, and these things,
No,
when they
because
go
some
to
people will
these
get to the end of the
seminars-
reading and say, oh, that's just fantastic.
Yeah, they're controlled, and a lot of people don't read the Bible. A lot of people that, I talk to, about, that I have talked to in the past, about, the Bible, they'll say, oh yeah, the Bible is terrific and blah, blah, blah. I never really read through the whole thing.
Yeah, right.
And they don't, I've actually had people who say they couldn't get past Leviticus. I can imagine why, because it's so gross.
But the Protestants, they do read the Bible. They
Well, not all of
You
them, but a
mentioned-
lot of them don't.
You mentioned the Bible studies classes.
Sure,
and
sure, but
Sunday
not
schools.
everybody goes to those.
But anyone that's attending church regularly is going to get hit with all the, the Gospels. They're going to get every single Gospel.
Yeah,
they'll get
but
Paul.
don't you think that, I know when I went to Sunday school, at the Greek Orthodox Church, a lot of the kids didn't pay any attention at all. I mean, I was like into literature, so I liked stories, so I was like really interested in all these stories, Of course, they were taught as truth, and I believed them at that time, I was small. But, a lot of kids didn't pay any attention. I bet if you asked them today, they couldn't tell you anything. Have you ever seen like Jay Leno when he does
Oh,
those.
that's terrible.
Yeah, I don't know if he does it, I haven't watched him in years now, but he used to do these things, and he used to ask, young people coming out of malls and stuff about, things about the Bible, and they didn't know like very basic things. It's like they're these young shopping pagans or something.
But they would mix up the history.
Totally,
Given the
and they'd
Bible.
ask him, and, our son Dimitri kept saying, well, Mom, the people are asking him questions on the spot and they're flustered or what have you, there's cameras on, right? But they found that that's not the case. That indeed,
They simply didn't know.
yeah, they just simply don't know, they have everything jumbled,
Yes.
they don't.
I believe that.
Yeah, so, how much belief is there? There's among certain people, there's really strong belief. That lady that worked for us was a Jehovah's Witness, and she used to read the Bible in all her spare moments and go to all the Bible studies.
On your time.
Yeah, well, no, but she was like, she really believed it.
Wow.
Yeah, Jim, she was trying to tell Jim something one day when they were working, and he started to explain to her that they were like written down by various people over the years, and she became very upset, almost hysterical.
Well, that's where I was hoping your lecture would begin, is to talk to that type of person and say, the author's style varies from book to book.
Well,
Just
Jim tried to tell
on a
her
very
that, she
fundamental-
became hysterical, he only got 3 sentences out.
What
And
did
he
she say?
spoke to her very kindly. She became very upset, she came up the stairs, she called her sister, and so finally, I didn't want her to stop working, it was a spring cleaning, so I said to Jim in Pig Latin, I said, "Stay on the Bible."
Knock it off.
And he stopped, I tell you about how Justina got hysterical.
Yeah.
When you started to
Yeah.
tell her a little
Poor
bit, in a
lady.
very kindly manner, in a calm manner.
Yeah, but, for a
She,
lecture,
she became very upset.
and that's, obviously, that wasn't gonna work with her, but for a
No.
lecture, I think that's a good tool to teach atheists about how do you approach, how do you talk to a
Right,
religious person who might be willing to listen, and say, have you ever realized that, this book and this book doesn't seem like it's been written by the same person? That the styles are so different between, say, Revelations and
Well,
Luke.
they'd say, of course they're written by different people,
But I
this
thought you
one
said
was
that
ins-
God wrote it.
Yeah, well, God inspired these people.
Yeah,
right?
and that's what my father would say. My father
Yeah.
would say, no, God didn't write the
See,
Bible.
yeah.
He inspired it as the scribe was
And
writing
don't
down.
forget, he inspired
Yeah.
man to interpret it properly too.
Yeah,
So, we've got double protection here, just in case you
Double
don't
protection,
believe
yeah.
something.
That's true. yeah. So what about these other books that were not included? Weren't they also inspired? Why aren't they included?
No, no. They threw out things in the, was it the Quran or was it the subsidiary works or whatever? But
Hadith.
they threw out, remember, what's his name? No, I can't remember his name, isn't that ridiculous? He's so well known.
Robert, are you speaking of the critic?
No, I'm speaking of the writer of the,
Muhammad?
I'm speaking of the contemporary writer that's been under a fatwa for like years.
Oh, yeah,
Rushdie?
Salman Rushdie.
Salman Rushdie, yeah, thank you, boy, senior moment, yeah, what was it, that book, I can't remember, but that's what they got so angry about, those passages that were thrown out, they had interpreted, earlier in their history, that those had been inspired by the devil,
Devil.
and they were contradictory to the other stuff, so they just threw them out.
Yes. But
Yeah.
they're still known. These are still existing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
But, he brought it up, in a way that they didn't like, so this is the thing, we excluded these things because they were incorrect, the people were heretics that wrote them, or they were like ignorant, or they weren't inspired by God, and you can see that it was all voted in.
Yes.
But I would think if you talk to a really thoroughgoing, believing Christian, that they would probably tell you, well, they were voted in because the people were inspired by God to vote for these things. And then you're back where you started.
Yeah.
I can see them coming up with that argument right away.
Forever, yeah.
Yeah. You tell them it's political, they don't understand. God did it. How do they elect the Pope? Can you imagine the politics there? Are those cardinals inspired?
Well, each one of them are eventually.
Well, but I mean, you know, it's so political, it's pathetic,
Oh,
but
yes.
but he's infallible on, you know, doctrine, church doctrine.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Mary. This was
Thank
very
you, Mary.
educational.
Thank
you,
you,
Nora.
thank you for your great comments.
Excellent.
Guys, they were all
Excellent
excellent,
comments.
thank you so much. Really, it was a good discussion, I think.